the institution of democracy still has authority. You can't just overthrow it because you didn't get the result that you wanted, even if it was a result that you thought was really important, because the democratic process is publicly justified to people in virtue of it allowing for more toleration, harmonization, and respecting freedom and equality. It's like a constant burying the hatchet is how I think of democracy. It's like, oh man, we gotta fight about this. We did, but no bloodshed. Majority rule, or I mean, no country actually has pure majority rule, but something like popular sovereignty.
Hello, my name is Skylar Kempton. Welcome to my channel where I explore politics, philosophy, and religion, sometimes all at once. Today I'm thrilled to speak with Dr. Kevin Vallier about philosophical liberalism and its non-liberal challengers. Kevin is an associate professor of philosophy at Bowling Green State University in Ohio and director of Bowling Green's Philosophy, Politics, Economics, and Law program. He's the author of several books, including Liberal Politics and Public Faith Beyond Separation, Must Politics Be War? Restoring Our Trust in the Open Society, Trust in a Polarized Age, and the latest, All the Kingdoms of the World, on radical religious alternatives to liberalism. He has written over 40 peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters, and on top of that, he's written articles for a general audience, such as for the Wall Street Journal. His website is kevinvallier.com, and you can read his newsletter, The Liberal Tortoise, on Substack. So, full disclosure, I was briefly a student of Dr. Vallier's at Bowling Green State University during my nearly as brief time as a philosophy grad student there. Although I decided not to continue in that graduate program, I've continued to think about some of the philosophical issues I encountered there, specifically the questions about liberalism raised by Kevin Vallier. So Kevin, thanks so much for joining me today.
Very, very happy to do so.
Yeah. So first off, could you share a bit about your personal intellectual journey? So how did you become a political philosopher, and how did you reach your personal beliefs about political philosophy?
So I was interested in philosophy from a pretty early age, and I did these summer camps at Duke when I was like 13, 15, 16. And we did philosophy of science and genetics and philosophy of mind. And I really, really loved philosophy of mind. I really loved it. So I was very interested in consciousness. And it was one of the things I was interested in when I went to WashU as an undergrad. I was also very interested in physics. And ultimately, I realized that I was interested in metaphysics. But I hadn't been especially interested in politics, except that this was, in high school was the late 90s, and I was in South Alabama. And my parents are kind of, my mom was a teacher, her parents are education professors. And so they were kind of New Deal Democrats. And that's also when the moral majority was just very, very, very strong. We debating questions about like whether gambling should be legalized. And those are really important debates then about whether there should be sodomy laws and stuff. So, different kinds of issues than today, whether Bill Clinton was morally fit to be president. And the Republicans kind of changed their standards on that a bit. So when I got to WashU, it was the 2000 election, and I decided to work on the Gore campaign. And I became like disenchanted really quickly because I realized a lot of people there didn't want to talk about the philosophical issues. Like, were we correct? A lot of the college kids there were kind of angling for jobs and stuff like that, and connections. And at the same time, there was this group called the Conservative Leadership Association, and it included a lot of discussion about political philosophy. So, I started hanging out with them, and they recommend a lot of different things to read, but there's a pretty strong libertarian streak. And so I got interested in libertarian ideas, in particular when I was 17. So I was at school at college. And then I continued a very strong interest in libertarian political philosophy until I was about 21 or so. But I was also interested in lots of other questions, social questions about social conservatism, I started to have really big questions in philosophy of religion. So I went from being an atheist to a theist after studying Aquinas, reconverted to Christianity in my early 20s. So I was very interested in analytic philosophy of religion as well. I did get in my top grad school my first year out of WashU. So I went to St. Louis University, which is a Catholic institution, and studied a lot of philosophy of religion, a lot of Aquinas, and just in general was able to have a lot of really good conversations there. And so what happened as a result is I became interested both in sort of religion and politics. And so early on in graduate school, I started working on that. I was interested in more moderate forms of libertarianism, like classical liberalism. I was interested in progressive liberalism and the kind of debates that they had and who was right and who was wrong. And started to see that left liberals had more points than I had realized. I wouldn't call myself one, but I think of myself as, pretty broadly stalwart in the liberal tradition. Should talk about in a moment. So that's kind of the story of the last, I don't know, 28 years or so, I suppose. So 27.
Great. Yeah, I think you said at one point, just in class or something, that you had a variety of views that people in sort of overlapping circles, political and philosophical circles, and some of the views that you had in one circle would have seemed crazy to people in the other circle.
Yep, that's right. That's right. That's right. Among libertarian philosophers, I'm part of the theistic and Christian minority. And among Christian philosophers, I'm one of the classical liberal minority. Although in studying Christian philosophers, almost everyone is doing metaphysics, epistemology, philosophy of religion, and so some philosophy of mind, and some ethics, but almost no one does political philosophy. But when they do, I mean, their politics kind of settle into a kind of median society Christian philosophers, probably a pro-life New Deal Democrat, pro-life social democrat. So yeah, I'm heterodox, but I'm also heterodox in my heterodox subgroups. So
yeah.
It's fun. I mean, in one way.
Yeah.
So, and I mean, I think they've got interesting kinds of overlap where you think, well, Christianity kind of specifies a pretty thick morality for individuals and small groups, but doesn't commit itself on sort of bigger institutional questions. Christians have held like every major political view that wasn't expressly anti-Christian: socialism, and anarchism, capitalism, the mixed economy. And so that's a thing I've been thinking a lot about recently. But I've also been very interested in doing work on trust and polarization and looking at the consequences of that I think has made certain kind of radical views on left and right seem more palatable. Because you just think, well, the other side, I mean, they have nothing to contribute. And so I've been very interested in the kind of mass psychology of like trust and polarization, but I've also been interested in the kind of ideological systems that are getting more play as a result of polarization. And a lot of people working on those ideas on the left, but not a lot of people, almost no one in academic political philosophy was addressing anti-liberalism on the right in any kind of even remotely sympathetic way. So yeah, I was very interested in those questions. There was another place where my philosophy of religion and political philosophy interests came together. So Oxford invited me to write All the Kingdoms of the World, or the early versions, in 2020, given the popularity of these views digitally. And I just spent a huge amount of time studying these traditions, mostly Catholicism and sort of broader Christian stuff, but I got fairly deep into Sunni Islam and Chinese Confucianism as well, the anti-liberalisms that you see kind of more popular in the 21st century, especially among intellectuals. So a lot of my work focuses on their what we call their political theology, and the treatises on political theology they've written, where political theology is trying to answer the classical questions of political philosophy, but within a particular theological framework. So questions about, say, the authority of government and what rights we have and what justice requires. what the good life consists in, and so on.
So let's talk about liberalism in particular. So liberalism is this confusing term that in popular discourse means a lot of things. So in the US context, it's often synonymous with left of center or progressive. In the European context, it often refers to supporters of free market capitalism, but it has a larger meaning in the context of philosophy. So let me ask you the big question. How do you define liberalism?
Sure. So I recently did a graduate seminar on liberalism, but I wanted to try to represent the liberal tradition as a whole. And it is a kind of set of political principles into something of a worldview in some people's hands. But some people see it as a doctrine about like what the good life is, like a life of autonomy or something like that. That's not how I think about liberalism, even though it has been a way that many liberals have. And it's not merely a defense of certain institutions like markets or the welfare state or constitutional rights or democracies. It's kind of something in between. I think of liberalism as a kind of set of principles of justice, what we owe others. And I think there's kind of broad agreement on a number of values, but the main four I take it to be are these. One is that people are naturally free, meaning that no one's born into subordination relations with anybody else, with the exception of course, children to parents. And that this has some important political consequences, which is that in some sense or another, governments derive their legitimacy from the consent of the governed or for some kind of related idea. That also is important that we're naturally equals, not that we have equal capacities, but that we have equal worth or value. And this has really important implications for government as well, because everyone has to be treated the same, say before in the rule of law in terms of their rights and so on. So that's also very important. And I think among those rights are both of liberty and equality are rights to participate in politics. So I think that leads, but sometimes democratic politics can be oppressive. And in those cases, you do need constitutional protections on democracy in order to protect basic rights. So I do think a kind of constitutional democracy is a natural implication of liberalism. Well, on top of that is a principle of toleration, particularly with respect to religion. Some people take this in direction of like secularization or privatizing religion in the public square. I've been very much against that branch of liberalism that's probably strongest in France with its tradition of laïcité. I'm much closer to the American view that sort of says, well, bring it all into discourse. I mean, that's okay. But you need you don't want an established church at the federal or state level. So freedom, equality, toleration, and the final principle is the harmony of interests. So liberalism's pretty unique in thinking that we can really make the most of our differences to make each other better off. This is one reason that liberals have always been defenders of the fundamental right of private property, even if they think there should be like regulations or redistribution or what have you. It's a very in opposition to full-blown socialism, but it's also because it's kind of suspicious of hierarchies. It's very suspicious of hierarchies if they're not agreed to, and so in that way, it's quite different than conservatism. So the thought is, look, you tolerate different views. That is a fundamental moral principle, but against I think both conservatives and socialists, there's a much broader willingness to tolerate a diversity of views because, for instance, one thing the socialist tradition has struggled with as a whole is religious toleration, because there's oftentimes this view that say religion is the opiate of the masses. And there have been religious forms of socialism, but the main threat of socialism is free thought and a pretty deep set hostility to organized religion. Now, that's in a lot of liberals, but then there's a lot of liberals that don't have that view at all. Say the great Catholic liberals like Lord Acton and Alexis de Tocqueville. So the principle of toleration is important. It can be taken in a secular direction, and that's not the direction I go. The harmony of interest is also really important too, because we do have differences. We're supposed to tolerate those differences, but there are certain kinds of policies that you can have such that people can realize their interests together. They can make each other better off. So liberalism is very much the win-win political tradition. For instance, you don't necessarily have conflicts in society in terms of class. That's one difference from much of the socialist tradition. Class conflict is not inevitable. I mean, it's not exactly inevitable in the socialist tradition. It's just much harder to avoid unless you make some really, really revolutionary changes. So those are the broad values that can be interpreted in different ways by different liberals. But what I take makes for a liberal broadly is that you've got kind of four principles, at least four principles of justice, that people should be treated as free and equal, differences should be tolerated, and interests, insofar as one can, should be harmonized. And I think this is one really important thing about both democracies and markets, and the welfare state, because they all can serve this function. Democracy in terms of letting us, our differences, we bury the hatchet peacefully every 4 years. We don't necessarily give up on what we thought, but we don't have wars of succession, I think it also requires markets, because markets are a much better way of allowing people to benefit one another than the abolition of markets. And I also think the welfare state's important to reduce imbalances of power in the market, so that people's like fundamental well-being and health and stuff don't depend on the whims of their employers. So I've defended, all of those institutions in my books, and I've defended all of those principles as well. But yeah, I would say the broad contours are freedom, equality, toleration, and the harmony of interests, and then constitutional rights, democracy, markets, and the welfare state. So that's kind of how I see it. Because I mean, the welfare state really is something that liberalism brings to bear. I mean, many socialists support it, but many socialists have thought that like it doesn't go anywhere near far enough. You have to have government control of capital. There are some liberal socialists out there. And so, there are some important differences with socialism, very big differences, and there's some very big differences with conservatism. And I consider those the kind of three main active political traditions at least since the middle of the 19th century. So those are kind of big three. And I tend to distinguish liberalism from socialism and conservatism in that way. So a lot of stuff there, but it's important to try to be precise in a number of different respects with respect to the term, as you indicated.
Your intellectual work has focused a lot on, it's often focused on the theory of public reason liberalism.
Yeah.
What's the unique philosophical contribution of public reason liberalism in particular?
Sure. So public reason liberalism is a descendant of the social contract tradition, which many of your listeners will be familiar with. Not so much Hobbes here, but figures like Locke, Rousseau, Kant, and then later figures like John Rawls. And the thought here, at least with many of the social contract theorists, is that authority has to come from, in some sense, the consent of the governed, but of course you can't get express or always get tacit consent. And so one thing that you start to get is a focus on what people can rationally and reasonably accept. And the thought here is that, people's differing perspectives, some of them might not sort of get the moral truth, but they nonetheless have deep commitments in terms of conscience, in terms of their worldview, and that those merit a kind of respect. That's part of what to tolerate and allow for those views and involves respect for freedom and equality. But then how do you justify political institutions to people with very different values and commitments and very different forms of conscience? Well, the idea is that you have to come up with justifications that are amenable or recognizable by the reason of all. And that's where the idea of public reason comes in. And the idea of a public justification, that is a justification for a law or policy that can be justified to each sort of suitably qualified or reasonable point of view. So that's how I think about public reason. Is it's a kind of articulation, a way of thinking about the justification of political power under the commitments of freedom and equality, toleration, and the harmony of interest. Public reason just starts off, what's got to be justified to most people, right? That's going to involve measures of toleration, an underlying implication of harmony of interests, and everyone is owed a justification. They're all the same, and their fundamental liberties can't be restricted unless the restrictions are sort of compatible with their own values.
So I think there's different views on this question among public reason liberal thinkers, but I'll
Sure.
ask you your position. So you want to have a public justification for a particular policy, a particular constitutional stipulation, um, but can, if the justification is made, if people kind of accept the justification, um, do their values have to be in accordance with that position? Then, I mean, like, in other words, it seems to me, it seems difficult to imagine every policy or even every constitutional stipulation would be agreed upon by all reasonable people who have different values, right? So I mean, liberalism wants to kind of have a pluralistic, multi-value society where people with different values can be on board. That does seem to me like it's a bit of a stretch to have that to have everything I mean, obviously not everyone's going to agree on every policy, right? But even on a basic issue of values, I think I'm not sure whether everybody is sort of going to be on board. For instance, I mean, I'll take environmental policy. Some people may not feel that non-human animals are worthy of moral consideration, or the environment really makes that much difference. That's not really a value to them. Other people, that's a core value. And so some people may feel, this environmental regulation is not valuable to me. Other people might feel it's extremely valuable to me and it's very important for how I want society to look like. It seems like that sort of something you kind of have to fight out, in the public sphere. Like, I'm not sure we're going to have consensus on that among everybody, among all reasonable people. So so that's just one example. But for you, is it okay for there to be policies that people disagree on a level of values, so long as there's some kind of justification made that is, not just sectarian justification, not just, I believe this because, my religion says this should be the case, but I'm going to make this case because this is good for society, it's good for everyone. How broad do these principles have to be, I guess?
Sure. I mean, this is an important question. And this is why Rawls, for instance, focuses public reason on what he calls constitutional essentials and matters of basic justice, because we're not going to get public justifications on every law. What he does, and I think in a different way, Jerry Gauss does, my late dissertation advisor, was that you try to publicly justify decision procedures, like democratic voting or parliamentary democracy, so that even if we have policies that we don't like, they're justified in virtue of having the decision procedure justified to them. Now, there'll be a set of policies they would find unacceptable regardless. That is worse than nothing. So democracy does have some limits on what it can choose in order to track what's publicly justified. So there are a lot of issues where we disagree, where we say, look, we're really disagreeing on the proper tax level on the rich. Is it 20% or 80% or somewhere in between? If you take kind of certain positions, a range of positions that people advocate openly in the United States. But just about everyone agrees that democracy and voting is the way to resolve those disputes, and that if they don't get resolved in the way that you want, the institution of democracy still has authority. You can't just overthrow it because you didn't get the result that you wanted, even if it was a result that you thought was really important, because the democratic process is publicly justified to people in virtue of it allowing for more toleration, harmonization, and respecting freedom and equality. So that's kind of how I think about how we resolve some disagreements is through the democratic process, constitutionally governed. And the other nice thing about that is, they're I guess sometimes in democracy, they're permanent losers, but usually if someone's really convicted about something, there's, the election, there'll be another election, right? So, democracy, I call it's like a constant burying the hatchet is how I think of democracy. It's like, oh man, we gotta fight about this. We did, but no bloodshed. Majority rule, or I mean, no country actually has pure majority rule, but something like popular sovereignty.
So let's go ahead and turn to your latest book. It's called All the Kingdoms of the World on Radical Religious Alternatives to Liberalism. And in it, you discuss Catholic integralism in particular, as well as religious anti-liberalisms in general. So this is your brief description of integralism. Quote, Catholic integralists say that governments must secure the earthly and heavenly common good. God authorizes two powers to do so, they assert. The state governs in matters temporal and the church in matters spiritual. Since the church has a nobler purpose than the state, salvation, it may authorize and direct the state to support it with certain policies, such as enforcing church law. At times, the church may need assistance to advance its objectives, end quote. So integralism has a long history, which you talk about in the book. But walk me through specifically how it emerged, how it re-emerged very recently.
Sure. What I'd like to do first is talk about why it is anti-liberal. There is a sense in which people are naturally free under an integralist arrangement, but not in the sense that people are not interfered with. The fundamental kind of freedom is the freedom that comes from Christian belief and a membership in the church. So it's freedom not just to, it's freedom to choose the true good. So it has a different conception of freedom than liberalism does in terms of what freedoms should shape government. Even the notion of positive freedom in the liberal tradition, it's not specific to religion. The other really important difference, and this is really sort of the earth-shattering difference, is that in integralism, in liberalism, when we do political theory, we start with a relationship between the individual and the state and intermediary institutions, such that there's one polity which you're trying to shape. But for the integralists, they begin with there being two polities, an earthly polity and a heavenly one, and then ask about their integration. And so much of medieval political philosophy is about precisely that question, which is superior, how are they equal, how are they integrated, so to speak. And liberalism, at least since Hobbes and Locke, have said, no, there's really just one polity, the state, and they have some kind of control over religion, or maybe not much, maybe none. So it's anti-liberal also in that it rejects the disestablishment of religion. It's usually strongly establishmentarian, meaning you establish this, at least the majority religion, and hopefully that's also the true religion. So there is a different understanding of freedom. It's also a different understanding of equality because it's not a respect for multiple viewpoints among equals. It's a respect and concern for their objective interests as the Catholic Church understands it. But it is not respect for an equality of points of view. And this is why it's sort of fundamentally hostile, or at least very uneasy with parliamentary democracy, and why many integralists are attracted to monarchy. The idea of toleration is greatly truncated. In integralism, you do kind of have to tolerate people when they're unbaptized, but only in their religious practices that sort of abide by natural law. So if in your church can't marry people of the same sex because that's a violation of natural law, you can't have polygamy in your religion because that's a violation of natural law. But you do have to have respect for religious freedom among the unbaptized. But once people are baptized, they're a member of the heavenly polity. And in principle, they can be, charged for breaking the law. And this is true even of Protestants because they're heretics, according to the Catholic integralists. So once you're baptized, you can be forced to stay within the religion. You can be punished for the sake of religious ends, particularly your religious good. So it's quite paternalistic in that regard. And it has a very apocalyptic view of political life. It's clear kind of fight between the graced church and the church itself, and sort of demonic resistant forces. So one of the sort of seminal inspirational books in Catholic integralism is this old book, 19th century, called Liberalism is a Sin. It's about the cruelest book on liberalism that I've ever read. It's quite extraordinary. At the end, it talks about the necessity to segregate oneself from liberals, to completely not even interact with them. It's quite shocking. So Catholic integralism is it's anti-liberal. right? Like it's like really, really anti-liberal. It's not like democratic socialism where there's a lot of there's a lot, frankly, there's a lot of overlap, right? And Catholic integralism is very, not very much overlap, right? So that's what I mean by religious anti-liberalism, because I mean something like that holds for the other of people thinking are true religion. Okay, so how did it arise, how did it die, and how did it resurrect? Um, Integralism is a story about Latin Christendom, not Greek Christendom. So the Eastern Roman Empire, never collapsed until it was conquered by the Ottomans, 1435, and it was quite small by then. But you had a strong emperor in the East that played a very important role in religious life in terms of calling the ecumenical councils. The Council of Nicaea is called by the Byzantine Emperor. And also there were a whole bunch of what we call apostolic sees, that is, churches founded by the apostles, and they had their own bishops. So you had one emperor, and you had some 20 apostolic sees. And so you had lots of bishops. You didn't really have a head bishop. It sort of did, the Patriarch of Constantinople. But you also the Patriarch of Antioch and so on. So you've got a place where the state is strong and it's superior in power to the church. Latin Christendom is quite strange in world history, because you have a collapse of the Western Roman Empire, and you have all these small petty kingdoms. And what you also have is a religion with a very hierarchical governance structure that can acquire a lot of political power, in particular by providing the same kinds of, say, legal and healthcare services that the empire performed. So, dioceses were originally Roman jurisdictions. The title of pontifex was the Roman imperial title. So, you have all these, like, you can go to places between when a Chinese dynasty collapses and comes back, and you have all these little kingdoms and so on. But none of the religions common in China have like a rigid, centralized ecclesiology, and so, in India, you have all kinds of decentralized religion, but Hinduism is very, very, there's not a clear hierarchy. There's a lot less homogeneity. And a lot less rides in terms of eternal life and terms of having true belief. So what you get is this very powerful, very authoritative church in these lots of little kingdoms. So they look around and say, okay, well, there's maybe something good about this relationship, because it's good that the church has a certain kind of superiority to the state. On the other hand, scripture and tradition taught that the state actually predates the earthly church, back to the Old Testament monarchs, the Davidic monarchy, which had divine authorization. So you have a church that's superior in power and superior in aim, and you have lots of little states that can partner with the church, help to enforce its law. And as those states began to consolidate, especially in France, you started to have more of a kind of closer, more equal kind of relationship between Pope and Crown. And so by about the 11th century, when the church is kind of finally able to extricate itself from monarchical control, sort of in a weird way, you start to see people saying, like writing treatises and saying, no, this makes a lot of sense. And then on either sides of integralism, or those who say, look, the king has great ecclesiastical power, kind of common view in France. And then you have those views that the Pope has a tremendous amount of temporal power, which you found in Rome in many cases. And so there are a variety of figures, particularly during the Reformation and the resistance against the Reformation by the Catholic Church, a period of Catholic reform known as a Counter-Reformation in the 17th century. So in the 16th century, 16th, 17th, usually dated between the Council of Trent in the middle of the 16th century down to the Peace of Westphalia. So you have these rich treatises when Protestants are saying, no, the king should be sort of the general head of the church. And them saying, no, you have to have this integrated relationship. Now, in the 17th century, this was still on the table for many monarchies, even if many Catholic monarchs didn't respect it. But as the nation states consolidated more and more and more, the Pope's power became less and less relevant. Really until the 20th century, the Pope had his own domains outside of Vatican City, the Papal States. The Pope was a temporal sovereign for many centuries. And the nationalist unification movements, like in Italy and Germany and so on, those really ended a lot of the decentralization that you saw, with the obvious exception of Switzerland being a very big, very striking exception there. But there are lots of sort of smaller kingdoms and so on. But with the consolidation even of Germany and Italy, especially in Italy, the Pope's power, political power, waned and waned and waned. Now, you had the two late 19th century popes, Pius IX and Leo XIII, who asserted their authority as they understood it as a kind of this integralist, a kind of view. But that view quickly died out in the 20th century. And there are a variety of sort of reasons for this. One, integralism had become completely infeasible, right? Integralism had arisen when the Pope had kind of more authority and charisma and influence than most states. But by the 20th century, no state would listen to what it had to say, probably except Ireland, Quebec, and a few other places, Spain. But their leaders didn't, kowtow really very much. It's also the case, so people were thinking, okay, is this a bad arrangement? Or maybe this is a good arrangement, maybe this is better, or what we have to deal with. There's also this fact of pluralism, that the church had spent a lot of time trying to kind of eliminate Protestant subpopulations. So of course, Protestants did the reverse. It just hadn't worked. Every time they did it, it was just a bloodbath. It didn't really help the economy. And so, many in the Catholic Church just said, well, suppressing this stuff, it just isn't worth it. And that means we have to learn to live with others. And that means they can't have no power. They can't have no power. They have to have some. And once you start to acknowledge that, it's harder and harder to get integralism going. It's infeasible for lots of reasons. But then the church starts to look around and say, maybe this isn't so bad. Maybe our way of thinking about the freedom of the unbaptized, the fact that we don't force people to become a member of a religion, is also a reason to think we can't make them stay. And so they have to have a sort of measure of freedom there. And so the right of religious freedom gradually, slowly, came to dominate within the Catholic Church. Another pivotal moment was the church wanted to be involved in the post-World War II moral order, the construction of a more unified Europe, and then the UN. And then they were in a very complicated position because they had to say, look, we're going to be on board of religious freedoms for Catholics all over the world, but we're going to deny it to everybody else in our own regimes. And that was seen as kind of not diplomatically feasible. So a lot of these issues ended up coming to the fore in the Second Vatican Council, 1962, 1965. And I think what's critical there is there's also a really big liberalizing trend in theology, where people are kind of becoming sort of less certain about certain kinds of doctrines and teachings, maybe give more sort of non-literalist readings of Scripture and church teaching. So there are a lot of different forces going on in the Second Vatican Council, but their most controversial document that they promulgated is called Dignitatis Humanae, 1965. And Dignitatis Humanae declares, at least as just about everyone understands it in terms of how that was promulgated and quickly after the council, was that there was a universal right of religious freedom. And it just says this Vatican Council declares that the human person has a right to religious freedom. It's just in there. And so that basically killed off integralism outside of a sort of schismatic group or whatever. It was just seen as that the council didn't just put this aside practically, it put it aside morally. So that integralism was just a violation of the dignity of the person because it coerced people against their will religiously. But many of the sort of council fathers of Vatican II that were there, their thought was that they would have spiritual influence in a different and superior way through voluntary demonstration, through showing holiness and moral leadership and integrity. And that this would enable them to play a really important part in democracy because there'd be Catholic parties and so on. They'd respect freedom, but because they wouldn't be bound up with politics in their own domains, they could be less corrupt and more inspiring and so on. And this looked pretty true under the pontificates of Pope John Paul II and even to some extent under Pope Benedict. But really, it's Pope John Paul II is fighting against communism. He's fighting for democracy. He's partnering with world leaders to free people from oppression. And he was sort of fully on board with Vatican II and really did believe that Catholic teaching, Catholic moral teaching, was coming to be respected. Catholics were being discriminated against less in Protestant countries, and that Catholicism would be able to kind of be the city on the hill in these orders. And then that stopped being the case. Particularly, you get to the 21st century. First, you have all the sex scandals. And that's just a disaster for the church's authority. You'd also already had a collapse of the sort of very establishmentarian Catholic countries like the dictatorships of Franco in Spain and Salazar in Portugal, and the Quiet Revolution in Quebec, where Catholic power had just completely collapsed. You'd also had a surprising amount of spread of legalized abortion and the use of birth control, which is very shocking. And then the LGBT movement came along, and many Catholics were like, this was not supposed to happen. This is to think of the same-sex relationships being on a par rather than, as the Catholic Catechism put it, gravely disordered, was quite shocking. Something that the Vatican II fathers would never have considered even possible because of how, from their view, aberrant those relationships are. So they're losing on every major social issue. When the thought was, look, we're essentially making a deal with these liberal democratic states that will play our role, that we're not going to try to take over what have you, as long as our basic views are respected. But by the time you get to the 2010s, it's looking like that's not true. It's looking like elites are not just saying that, say, Catholicism is out, but saying that Catholicism and even conservative Protestantism is evil. And so many young Catholics, I think, have said, okay, liberal democracy was not a partner with the church. It was for a while, and then it got more powerful and it turned on the church. And so what are we going to do about that? And how do we have to think about the role of Catholicism in the public life of liberal democracies? Maybe liberal democracies had a tendency to turn anti-Christian, which was what the 19th century integralists were telling us would happen. But they were still dignitatis humanae in the way. The human person has a right to religious freedom. What do we do? Well, the integralists started in the mid-2000s. There was a sort of a man I admire a great deal because he was kind of had a one-man quest to reinterpret dignitatis humanae. Thomas Paine, so a very talented philosopher, an early modernist. I did a lot of important work on the Counter-Reformation, but on Hobbes and a few other figures. And he came up with this like pretty inventive new interpretation. And there was a host of sort of young intellectual Catholics, some of them at Catholic institutions like various Thomas Aquinas colleges, but also a number of people in Ivy League universities that were trying to think through, well, Catholicism is true, but it looks like, gradually we're just losing status, getting back to where we maybe were in the 50s and the 60s. And so a number of these young folks, not a huge amount, kind of started to form kind of social media organizations and over time digital publications that were trying to revive integralism on the grounds that liberalism was inherently corrupt. It was always going to turn against the church. It had been against the church many times before. And that their only way of dealing with this was to create a post-liberal order. That would be fundamentally and partly coercively guided by the church. Now, of course, this hasn't really gone much place in the church itself because, Pope Francis has said privately integralism is a plague, and the Catholic Church has 5,600 bishops all over the world, and none of them are openly integralist. But in politics, after 2016, Trump's election let a lot of weird new right factions grow and influence really quickly. And many of them got a lot of influence in terms of a kind of like new race realism, the post-Nietzscheans, the Straussians, although they had some power in the early 2000s, the Claremont Institute, for instance. You had the kind of techno-futuristic stuff that's now becoming more popular because it looks like the Silicon Valley overlords are starting just over the last couple of months. They're going right wing. And then you had like these nationalist conservatives, and then you had the integralists. And the integralists had an advantage over the other new right factions, which had centuries of incredibly sophisticated philosophical depth. And so there's a sense in which it was the most intellectually potent of the new right factions. And that's really when things started to change. 2016, a number of important figures converted to Catholicism that time, and we got on board with integralism pretty quick. And so you had this weird American integralist movement, which had been a kind of British philosophical movement following Pink's work, but became an expressly kind of political movement, a sectarian movement in the late 20-teens. And they continue to build, intellectual resources, expand their blogs, expand their Twitter outreach. Twitter outreach was huge. They're very countercultural, very good at kind of sophisticated trolling and memeing. Very keen on excluding outsiders, not engaging in dialogue, but trying to seem sort of super masculine. A lot of the new right factions very, very, very invested in sort of their understanding of masculinity, recovering masculinity. This is why I've never met a female integralist theorist. In fact, among the new right, I mean, it's stunning. Actually, there are fewer women there than there are in the libertarian movement, which, there's no Ayn Rand for these groups. So that's kind of where we are. And now that J.D. Vance has become the VP nominee, he spent a lot of time with these people. He even headlined a conference with Adrian Vermeule, the Harvard law professor who converted to integralism in 2016 after he converted to Catholicism the same year. And, they were the two keynotes at a conference in Steubenville. And I think Vance has called himself a Catholic post-liberal, which of integralists are an extreme variety. And so now we're going to have, I think, some degree of recovery of some of the ideas, although I think it's going to be in more vague terms in order to keep it palatable for them to have some influence. So I had thought it was going to be dead this year. I thought the only thing that will revive it if Trump survived all these scandals and then somehow nominated J.D. Vance, who had, despised him earlier. So that was very strange. Anyway, that's where we are is the last week or two in terms of all the way from the inception of Christianity. I know that's a long story, but it's awfully fun. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's improbable on the face of it. It seems to the outsider that integralism would be a major political force in the United States, simply because as you talk about, the idea is most integralist thinkers think you have to have a pretty large, or at least some Catholic majority in a country. The United States is not a Catholic majority country.
That's right.
Briefly, how did integralists kind of square that circle? How can you have integralism be in the United States, this, either Protestant or other religious or non-religious majority country?
You have to have a very strong theory of social change that is elitist. So a lot of the things like Vermeule is focused on is like politics is not just the art of the possible. Politics is also the art of shifting the overton window. And so that's one way radical groups can change things is by shifting what are legitimate topics of conversation. Also, Catholics are at the apex of their political influence in the United States. I mean, Biden is a Catholic. And I think it's not a trivial commitment to him. Nancy Pelosi is Catholic, former Speaker of the House. You have 5 Catholic Supreme Court justices, maybe 6, depending on how Gorsuch, you want to think about Gorsuch. So a lot of Catholic influence. And, Catholic intellectuals have always had outside influence intellectually in the American conservative movement. I mean, National Review is creating, starting in the 50s, a coalition of conservatives, but they're mostly run by Catholic converts. And And so the thought is, and it's also Catholic's influence in judicial philosophy and philosophy as well, with the revival of Thomism, and in particular being a big part of the revival of philosophy of religion in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And also with many Protestant denominations going more sort of theologically liberal, there's a lot of high-profile Protestant conversions to Catholicism, and that strengthened Catholicism intellectually quite a bit. And the integralists, I think, are thinking if they can become acceptable and a majority in these elite circles, then they'll be able to kind of shift the levers of power. And it may take several centuries, but the goal ultimately is to build a kind of radically post-liberal order, one whose underlying operating principles are quite different than liberalism. But it's a long-term project, although many of them have been excited about short-term moves. I think one of the things they're eager for now is Vance has used a lot of language about replacing the elite and sort of clearing out the administrative state, but still using it. Patrick Deneen, who's not really an integralist, but is sort of in that vicinity. He used to be big for decentralization, but his book from last year, Regime Change, was all about replacing elites and having the people guided by fundamentally socially conservative elites rather than socially progressive ones. And so they have an elite replacement strategy. And they think if they replace the elites, then they'll be able to lead the country in the directions that they want. But I think this kind of elite theory is not very plausible, in part because there are always competing elites. And what democracy does is it institutionalizes that fact in order to reduce levels of violence. And they have a weird picture where you can have a homogeneous elite and it be stable under modern costless communication and education and literacy, right? So yeah, their theory of elite social change is not very plausible at all. But that's how I think they are thinking, is that they'll control things at the elite level. They know they're never going to win an election on their own. They know that's never going to happen. So Vermeulen will say, look, we've got to get up in the judiciary, we got to get up in the administrative state. If we can do that, then we can really start to move things in our direction. So
yeah, interesting. Yeah. So moving to religious anti-liberalisms more broadly, you write, in All the Kingdoms of the World, quote, India shocks me. Its elite face a robust challenge from the Hindutva, the Hindu nationalist movement. One of the world's most ancient civilizations had adopted a mix of socialism and liberalism. India proved that Western political ideas had universal appeal, but today it returns to ancient political form, end quote. But here's a counter-analysis. So the Indian political scientist Pratap Bandhu Mehta was a guest on the podcast The Gray Area this month, in July. He spoke on Indian liberalism as well as the illiberal Hindutva movement. Now, this is part of what he said, quote, I would argue that Hindutva is actually a very modern phenomenon. What makes the emergence of Hindutva possible is the rise of the modern nation state. Because apart from liberalism being universalized, the one ideology that has become global in the 19th and 20th centuries has been nationalism, end quote. We can probably add socialism there, but definitely liberalism, nationalism as well. And Mehta went on to say roughly that the emergence of nationalism was disastrous for Europe in the 20th century and Hindu nationalism by importing this European-style sectarian nationalism to India is also playing with fire. But he said this is really a European thing. It's a modern European thing that the Hindu nationalists have imported to India, where it's about this sort of sectarian, view of the nation state, which India historically didn't have. It was pretty pluralistic. There were certainly, he talks about, sort of the issue for Indian liberals. The anti-liberalism in the Indian context, he said, had to do with caste, had to do with social power, and this sort of, inequality that was kind of baked in there with the caste system. But it wasn't necessarily about problems with value pluralism. But I want to ask more broad, in addition to that, more broadly.
Yeah, do you mind if I just say something about that? I agree that nationalism is a modern phenomenon. I just meant that Hinduism would have political influence again, because the India had been kind of founded when it was founded as a nation state, once the British left, as they kind of conceived themselves kind of a secular state. And I think now more people are saying, actually, we're not establishing Hinduism exactly, but that's kind of supposed to be the core. So for instance, you get in the BJP increasingly, although this was how it was founded, it moderated a lot under Modi's predecessors. That India is supposed to conceive of itself as a Hindu civilization. Hindus were very big on a false historical narrative of there being a continuous history. But what it is seemed to be doing is to reject the liberal part of democracy. Now, Hinduism isn't inherently democratic, and it's actually closer to liberalism in terms of its operation than almost any of the other major religions, in terms of its ecclesiastical structure, its openness, and to non-exclusivist in various ways. But what you do see is an attempt in creating a Hindu civilization to exclude the 200 million Indian Muslims. And historically, of course, India has been more tolerant of Muslims, and they're becoming less tolerant. So in those senses, yes, there are differences on the modern bit, but it's the rejection of particularly the liberal part that I see as that's the return to a form. But I probably could have, the Hindus were the group that I wish I had, it's the next group I was going to look at if I didn't feel like I had to just finish the book. And then I could have gotten into all the nuances there. And I've actually been wanting to write an essay on it for some time, because a really big part of reading their writings is the importance of creating a false and frankly ridiculous narrative of a unified Indus Valley civilization that goes back for 6,000 years. So that's the way of saying I actually think you're correct. It's just that I didn't get to say much and sort of flesh out what I meant there.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, so broadly speaking, what do you think the relationship is between liberalism, illiberalism, and nationalism? So let's bring in this idea of nationalism and nation states. I think it's fairly important because a lot of this, I think a lot of anti-liberalism talks about is concerned with this idea the nation state is dying. There's immigration, there's global connectivity, obviously. And I think there's a certain anxiety about the decline of the nation state, which seems to drive some illiberalism. But liberalism itself also has this complicated relationship with the nation state. This is something that Mehta talked about. That liberalism precedes liberal theory began before the nation state existed. So
the modern
nation state, yeah.
And
especially this European idea of a nation state kind of tied to a particular ethnic group or religious group or whatever. So yeah, I'm just curious if you have any thoughts about this relationship: liberalism, illiberalism, nationalism.
Yeah, there have been liberal nationalists, but in the sort of back half of the 20th century, because nations were a good bulwark against certain other forms of domination. And nations are also better than more decentralist arrangements because you could create a whole division of labor, a national economy, and so on. There are some thoughts about nation states being better protectors of freedom. In the post-war era, liberals were the ones chiefly responsible for trying to build an international order and to defend it. And that's why today liberal nationalism would seem kind of contradictory to us, because it's really the liberals who were building, the left liberals, but the liberals building the post-war institution. It was really kind of liberal, left-leaning liberalism, or sort of liberal democratic socialism that won the Second World War in terms of ideology, with communism being the kind of junior second place winner, and then ultimately liberal democracy defeating communism as well. And so when liberalism is just totally dominant in the 1990s and 2000s, and in early 2010s before Trump and Brexit, this is really the time of liberal internationalism. Even in the hawkish right? The thought is, look, we're going to go in there and create a liberal democracy. And so I think that is one reason that liberalism can seem non-nationalist, but it really just depends on which arrangements liberals think are going to best promote liberty and equality, given the outside threats and alternatives. That nationalism came to be associated with, racism and liberalism. There have been people that were liberals and serious racists and eugenicists, but there's still the thought that that's kind of, there's at least a tension there, a kind of incoherence with fundamental liberal principles. So today, though, you are right that but the reason for this is pretty interesting. It's that the anti-liberals see liberalism as colonialist and hegemonic. which isn't entirely wrong if you're in India, if you're in China, any host of countries around the world. So a lot of anti-liberals are anti-colonialist. So, for instance, with the one of the most influential anti-liberals of the back half of the 20th century is Said Qutb, who, after his radicalization, he was some sympathy for him early on, was imprisoned, tortured in Egypt, but started to say that even the Muslim countries around the world were in a state of jahiliyyah, or ignorance. And that made the states that governed them illegitimate. And this is what laid the groundwork for the ideology and legal order of ISIS. But it was, if you read his earlier stuff, like Social Justice in Islam, his pre-radicalization, it's very anti-colonialist, very anti-racist, very anti-imperialistic. And this is what you see in many of the Catholics. They're not anti-imperialist in the sense that they're ejecting a colonial power, but they are seeing themselves as being kind of dominated and controlled by a hegemonic cultural force. So one of the reasons these groups are nationalistic is they see the nation state as a way of creating a more multipolar world and dethroning sort of liberal colonialist, imperialist hegemony. Very true of the Hindutva, true of many of the different strands of thought in China, very true in many Islamic countries, probably the strongest there in many respects. So that's kind of think about the shifting relationship between liberalism and nationalism.
Yeah. I want to turn to a couple current events topics. So
Sure.
a little bit away from pure theory here, but it's related.
Yep.
So first, on October 18th of last year, you wrote a post for your newsletter, The Liberal Tortoise, called The Left, the Right, and the Liberals, which spoke positively of the support among left liberals, right liberals, and the new right for Israel, in contrast with more pro-Palestinian sentiment among leftists.
And it was also about Ukraine. So yeah, it was. So I
Yeah.
was trying to, this was, remember, this was very early.
That's my next line.
Yeah, very early in the
The post was
Israeli-Palestine, like the current Israel-Hamas war, very early.
I'll tell you, that's my next line. The post was written shortly after the October 7th Hamas attack on Israel.
Yeah.
More attention mostly shifted to the Israeli war in Gaza that followed. Um,
Yes.
so a recent statement by the human rights organization Amnesty International includes this characterization of Israel's actions during the Gaza war. Quote, Israel has been flagrantly flouting international humanitarian law on a cataclysmic scale for the past 9 months, carrying out deadly and unlawful attacks during its onslaught in the occupied Gaza Strip that have claimed unprecedented toll on civilians, end quote. So given what has occurred over the course of the war, how should liberals approach Israel's war in Gaza, in your view?
Yeah, I mean, there are some political issues of which I try to be deliberately ignorant, because every time I learn about something, I might take a view that's gets me in trouble with one group or another, because it's happened every time I look deeply into something. I don't know why that is. So there's a couple of issues that I just avoid like the plague. And I understood that Netanyahu had to keep certain far right factions happy. But I don't think anyone really expected the scale of the attack. Maybe some people did, but it was far in excess of what I thought it would be. Now, I've tended as a liberal to be a defender of the right of the Jewish people to have a state, and of course a supporter of liberal democratic institutions there, with the large appropriate exceptions being made for in the proper places. However, I think it's hard to look, for instance, at just war theory. Liberals have had different kinds of views: pacifists, nationalists, anti-interventionists. All liberals do not tend to have a consistent foreign policy over the course of their histories, a huge range of views. But it's hard. So I did not, I mean, at the time, that was about a week afterward. I thought, of course, Israel has to respond. They have to respond in order to prevent these kind of horrors from happening again. But well, how much of Gaza is basically uninhabitable right now? It's like it's not a trivial amount. Um, so yeah, that's the difficulty, is the proportionality requirement in just war theory. And so that's the difficulty. Um, um, but yeah, I grew up in, like I said, in South Alabama during the 90s, where you had a lot of people who believed a doctrine is actually uncommon in Christianity, that Israel were still kind of God's people. And so I'm just like this deep aversion to criticizing Israel. I'm very uncomfortable when I do it. And so I've tended to avoid that. But I do think there's an argument to be made, um, uh, less common in your generation than mine, but that there's a real disproportionality worry. So
I think you mentioned earlier about liberals. You were saying what was the line talking about that there what is sort of owed to people as a matter of kind of basic.
yes, human rights.
Yeah, this is a
Yep.
yeah. So I mean, I think
And equal political rights, which is that's one of the main issues. Freedom of movement, also, big issue.
right, right.
So
And so I think what I would argue is setting aside the big picture complexities of what you want to say about Israel Palestine and what you want the solution to be, what you think about history. I think you have to think what is owed to civilians in both
yeah,
Palestinian territories and Israel. Uh,
yeah, yeah,
you spoke, I think, rightly that the left was callous toward Israeli civilians in the Hamas attack. But I think that there has been, Israel and Israel Palestine has exposed a weakness in among many liberals, in that there is this blindness towards Palestinian civilian suffering, and the left.
yeah. That's probably fair. I think a lot of it's the sense of continuity of institutions. I think it's also a lot of it's age. A lot of it's that liberals tend to be older than leftists. And that's very contingent factor. In fact, we weren't even really making the leftist liberal distinction for decades, unless you were pretty seriously socialist. So yeah, I think that is an important difference. Like again, like my generation and older, I'm still like I don't enjoy credit. I mean, some countries I'm like totally neutral, happy to criticize the Hindu or whatever. But when it comes to criticizing Israel, yeah, I have a real aversion to it. And so I think that's probably what's going on, is that they're more like in your generation, there's just not that same discomfort. So yeah, I think age is probably something to do with it, and your age's proximity to the Holocaust in particular. So yeah, no, I think that may well be a reasonable criticism, but a lot of the views get out there that I start to get real uncomfortable, like that Israel has no independent right to exist or so on, or that this is genocide or something. But like I said, I deliberately avoided Israel Palestine, because I just don't know enough about the history to say anything beyond stuff that's kind of platitudinously liberal. So yeah, I think that's potentially a good concern. So
A second topic in current events. You're on X, that's formerly Twitter, on July 15th. Quote, prediction: if Trump wins in November, VP Vance will energize all the post-Trump factions on the new right. I also predict that leading Catholic post-liberals will bury the hatchet in the hopes of expanding their influence. As I've said, a VP Vance is post-liberalism's great hope, end quote. So you brought up JD Vance a little bit earlier. But yeah, what should we know about JD Vance's political philosophy? This person who, I was aware of him for a little while, but obviously his influence has just skyrocketed. What should people know about JD Vance in this philosophical context?
yeah, so he's always been most as I can track. I mean, I don't know exactly what his views are when he was at Yale Law School. But he's always been kind of related to or close to certain kinds of radical groups. Like, for instance, he worked for Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel's, in some ways, a pretty hardcore libertarian. He's got a lot of worries about democracy. He's a major funder of kind of illiberals or liberal-leaning Republicans in. He was also a big contributor to Vance's campaign, probably saved him in the Ohio primary. But Vance also converted to Catholicism not a crazily long time ago. And if you're into intellectual Catholicism on the right, you know what integralism is, you know post-liberalism is, and the younger people get, the more they talk about it. J.D. Vance is 2 years younger than I. First major political candidate that is not much older than me. And I think that he's described himself as a post-liberal. He in Politico, if you look at this on Pat Deneen and regime change, they're in this the picture together that he headlined this conference, Restoring a Nation, in 2022 with Adrian Vermeule in Steubenville. He didn't go down there for votes. He already had them. He didn't go down there for money. He already had it. Why is he appearing with these folks? Why are the integralists taking pictures with him and putting them on the internet? Why do all the current integralists, except for Vermeule, got on Twitter basically, and the American ones, and said, "My good friend J.D. Vance, congratulations to my friend J.D. Vance." So he knows their view, and I suspect it pals around with them and is friends with them in part because he probably disagrees with them to some extent, but thinks, well, these guys, they got kind of silly radicalism, but when it comes to liberalism, they're sort of broadly correct. Of course, also the Appalachian background, hillbilly elegy, I think, is a genuine source of worries about kind of liberal capitalism and the effects that it has had in kind of creating the Rust Belt, and so on. So I think he was kind of already primed to be the most anti-free market GOP senator. That isn't really surprising. The interesting thing is, to me, so I think he just knows all the new right factions, tons of people over there, friends with a lot of them. So that's part of the story. The most interesting thing to me is that he seems to cut across these factions, but all of them like him. Which is really interesting because it's rare for them to all like anything, except for maybe Trump. And the interesting thing to me is how to square his sort of connections with the tech transhumanist people and the Catholic post-liberal people. Traditionally, continental conservatives have been like anti-industrial revolution and like very suspicious of technology. And even some sort of British conservatives like Tolkien, like very, very worried about technology. I mean, the whole Ents Saruman thing is like you're destroying the environment with this sort of horrific manufacturing. So I don't know quite how he squares those. I don't know why Adrian Vermeule and Elon Musk would be, both. Well, Musk is less of an influence because I think Thiel has been pulling Musk right, but was also employed J.D. Vance. So I don't know all of his private personal views, but I do know he spent a huge amount of time with all those folks. They all know him. They're all calling him his friend on Twitter, and I'm sure they mean that. So yeah, I think if you have the closest to a post-liberal in a Republican congressman, it's a post-liberal. That's him. And even with Harris taking over, the odds are still against her. And that means we could have a post-liberal millennial VP and very easily a post-millennial VP or president. Something with which I'm quite concerned. So
last major question. This has sort of been something that people have thrown around since Trump entered the scene, and so I'm reluctant to kind of give you this canned question, but I'm interested to know what you think. which is the Trump movement, the MAGA movement. Is this a cult of personality, or is this an ideological movement? And Vance seems to be the most ideological. Vance being VP seems like there's a more ideological heft to the MAGA movement now. How do you see? Clearly there's a minority, but it's a large grassroots movement supporting of Trump. Um, uh, and now the Trump Vance ticket. Do you see a clear ideology there, or is it still at the moment sort of a cult of personality around Trump?
It just depends on whether it's mass and elite. It's mass, it's something approaching a cult of personality. In particular, the ways that people get sucked into, pro-Trump conspiracy theories that start to be like incompatible with Christianity. Many Christians who are willing to overlook whatever Trump does. And in many ways, they spend more time on Trump than they do in church. I don't spend enough. I mean, they're my fellow Christians, but I just think I worry that their devotion to Trump has replaced their faith in a certain important way. I don't know if I'd go as far as to call it a cult of personality, but I would call it something like that. And at the elite level, yeah, there's this ideological stuff. I don't think there are that many like Ivy League degree Trump supporters that are just like obsessed with the guy, So yeah. Quasi cult of personality at the mass level, ideological at the elite level.
Well, thank you so much, Kevin. But I want to ask lastly, what projects are you working on now? What should we keep an eye out for?
So there's two projects. One is I'm doing a bunch of research, empirical research on trust, social norms and American poverty at the University of Pennsylvania with Christina Bicchieri. He's one of the world's leading scholars on social norms. We've done this big national survey where we have a theory about how trust and norms are related. With time, that may become a book, but it's already a couple of articles that we're drafting right now. Just working on it last night. And then there's going to be a much bigger project in sort of positive political theology. Now I want to say what I think the proper Christian political theology is, and talk about its relationship to liberalism.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk. It's been really good conversation, Kevin.
Yeah. Thank you.